In this video, you are going to get the ultimate guide to operating cameras and directing video for your church live stream. We'll be covering the essentials of topics like framing, headroom, composition, exposure, and we'll even talk about some advanced features that are available out there with these Canon PTZ cameras, such as the auto tracking. A huge thank you to Canon for sponsoring this video and providing the cameras to make this training possible. We'll be demonstrating the Canon CRN 500 and 700 PTZ cameras. I'll also be able to show you the XF 605 professional camcorder, which pairs perfectly with the PTZ camera. I'm gonna link those specific cameras below this video. I've developed this training to be comprehensive, but very simple. So even if you are a new camera operator or new video director at your church, maybe you're a volunteer, you are in the right place. My name is Jake Gosselin with Churchfront. We're here to be your roadmap for worship and production ministry. If you'd like more training content like this video, be sure to subscribe. This training is going to be in-depth, so be sure to refer to the chapter markers on the playhead below for convenient navigation of the video. First, I'm going to cover how to dial in the exposure settings for your camera. It's very important to make sure the exposure looks correct, because all of the other steps we're going to cover in this training, like framing and composition and movement, nothing's going to look great if you don't have the camera exposure set properly. I want to remind you to ensure you have sufficient lighting at your church. This is a very crucial ingredient before you dive into your camera settings. Make sure you have sufficient front lighting on stage and you know what temperature that front lighting is. Here in our setup, we are using some front washes that are at 4,000 Kelvin. We also have some backlights or hair lights, and those lights we often use different colors like blues and purples or maybe ambers. Those look really great in helping separate the foreground from the background on the subject. But the key here for your cameras, and especially in a church environment for your live stream, is make sure your pastor, worship leaders, MCs have adequate front lighting when you expose the cameras. And what we do for our church is our front lighting does stay consistent throughout the entirety of the service. So we use that same brightness front lighting for a pastor as well as for worship leaders. So then our cameras aren't having to adjust exposure throughout the service. Let's go ahead and dive into the settings of the Canon CRN 500 and we can adjust the exposure. So I do recommend running your camera in manual mode, which you can see right here. And if I switch to auto, some interesting things start to happen. Mainly the color, looks like the white balance sort of shifted around here. Let's go back to our manual mode, and this looks very natural. So manual mode is going to give you control over your iris or your aperture value. That's how large the opening is going to be in your lens for the light to hit the sensor. And then you also have control over gain. Another term for this is ISO or ISO, and this is the gain of the sensor. So sometimes if it's dark, you can add some gain to the sensor, but beware, as you add more gain, it's going to start introducing more noise. And then the third piece of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. So our system, we are running our frame rate for our cameras at 29.97. So a good rule of thumb is to run your shutter speed at least twice the value for the denominator of that shutter speed, twice the value of your frame rate. So in this setting, we are 29.97 for the frame rate for our system, and then we are going to run our shutter at 1/60th of a second. Another quick tip to make sure you're following some best practices is under the shutter mode in the software, you can go to angle, and you can have it on 180 degrees. If you don't have that type of setting though, you could just do seconds and then do 1/60 if you're doing 30 frames per second or 29.97. What's really great about this particular camera is we also have an ND filter built in, so I can add a quarter, a 16th, or a 64 worth of ND filter to it, but of course it gets really dark. This would come in handy if you had a super bright room and you want the ability to keep your aperture low, because the other way you could be darkening an image is if you turn up the aperture, and maybe you're in a really bright situation, you have to turn up the aperture. But if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to lose the nice bokeh effect, see how the background is nice and blurred out because I have a low aperture right now. If you don't want to lose that in a bright environment, that's where an ND filter can really come in handy. And again, let's say we were struggling with a darker environment. I'll simulate that with an ND filter. I could use the gain here. I could start turning it up. But you can see it starts to just create some noise in the image because it's really just turning up the gain or the signal of that video signal on the sensor, and that's going to start distorting it, similar to if you were to jack up the gain on an amplifier for a guitar, it adds distortion. So I'm going to go back down to here. I had my gain at around 4.0. Let's turn off the ND filter. I am very happy with this exposure setting. And then the other thing that's really closely related to exposure, we talked about the light side of things, the brightness of the image, but we also want to think about the white balance. And this is where we're going to talk about the temperature of the image. So you can do auto white balance here, and the camera does an okay job of setting white balance here automatically, but I would rather do it manually because I know the temperature of my front lights, and I just really want to be able to dial in precisely what those skin tones especially are going to look like for the subjects on stage. So here I can adjust the temperature. If I turn it all the way down, that is going to cool the image quite dramatically because I'm telling it that my source light is actually around 400 Kelvin. So it's basically trying to compensate for that by dramatically cooling the look of the image. If I went all the way up to the right, I'm telling it my source light is super bright, so it's trying to warm it. So that's why when you skew away from whatever temperature your front lights are, that's why the color just isn't going to look very natural. You want it to look, for the most part, in most situations, you want it to look the same in your camera for your live stream as what it does in person. There are all sorts of other white balance color settings you can dive into with this very powerful camera, but for the most part, if you have solid lighting already set up, it should look good with minimal adjustments. You really just need to focus on the color temperature setting. This camera also comes with things like image quality details that you can also adjust, and you can crank up the sharpness if you want, but to me, what I love about the cameras is they already look really great outside of the box. So a lot of these things I would leave up to your own creative discretion and preferences of how you want that final image to look. Here we have the focus settings on this camera, and what's great about these PTZ cameras is the autofocus is really good. So I could turn the focus off if I wanted to, and I could actually even just click with my cursor on the image if I want to select what to focus on. But in most cases, we are filming people, and Canon's face detection autofocus is really solid. As soon as I turn that on, you can see the little frame that shows up here. Of course, that frame doesn't show up on our actual program view or the camera input going into the switcher, but that looks really solid. And I recommend having the face autofocus on for a lot of your main follow cams in your broadcast setup. You can see as he's moving around, it is just locking in on his face, and maybe even start turning towards your side a little bit more. Let's see when it loses it. So he has to be turned a complete almost 90 degrees looking to the side for it to lose it, but then as soon as he turns back towards the camera again, it comes right into focus and it detects his face. I highly recommend saving a preset once you've dialed in the exposure settings for your camera. So if we go over to the preset page over here, we can go down and I can select another spot. You can see I've already made quite a few presets, but I'll select another preset number down here, 12. I'll press add. And then here what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to disable the pan, tilt, zoom, focus settings. I don't want to necessarily save those. I just want to save these camera settings, the exposure, image, focus settings, and then I can update the thumbnail, and I'll call this standard exposure settings. And then I can add it. And now we have this standard exposure settings saved to this preset on the camera, so it's very easy to recall if needed. Now it's time to cover the operation of your camera. And in this environment, we're gonna be using the Canon CRN 500 to talk about best practices for things like headroom, framing, and composition for your church live stream. Headroom is the concept of how much space is there between the top of the subject's head and the top of the frame. So I'm looking at my monitor above the camera I'm filming this video on, and you can see I have some space here. This would look really strange if for this video that I'm filming right now, I was positioned like this in the framing, or if I was like way down here in the framing. You can have too little or too much headroom, and it just does not look very natural. So a nice quick rule of thumb is I like to kind of envision the subject maybe having their hand on top of their head, and then that leaves an adequate amount of space for headroom. That hard and fast rule doesn't necessarily apply to every single composition that we're gonna have. It might change a little bit if it's a super wide shot or if it's a super tight shot. You can adjust headroom appropriately. But for most of the standard waist up shots, like what I'm gonna frame right here on the PTZ camera that you're seeing, most of these shots, that rule can apply pretty well. So you can see here, Matt, go ahead and like put your hand above your head. Let me just kind of simulate a little bit of that. And again, it's not a perfect rule, but that's pretty close to guessing of how much headroom he should have. You can take your hand back down, Matt. The other thing I like about the video switcher I have here is it's got some guides actually built into the preview monitor. So when I'm previewing the image before I make it go live on my program, I can actually check with the little line here on the top of the preview image if there's appropriate headroom. So not all video switchers have that. So that's why I also like people to think about if the subject were putting their hand above their head, that's a good guide as well for headroom. Now I want to talk about the most common types of compositions you'll see when it comes to framing a subject like a pastor or a worship leader or an MC for your church live stream. The first composition is what I want to call the waist up shot. So you can see here in my preview monitor, this is what I would consider a waist up shot. Maybe I could come in a little bit tighter here. And the goal with any of these shots, when I say waist up, I'm actually referring to not exactly on his waistline, but just a little bit below it. It looks a little unnatural when I give you these certain body parts to aim for the bottom of the framing. You don't want to put the actual bottom of the frame on the waist or the knees. You want to just do it just below them and give it a little bit of space. So here is what the waist up shot looks like. And this is also just called a center up shot. And you can see on the preview monitor, I'm using the center third of the image to center the subject. So this will be very common for worship leaders or preachers. We would want to keep them at the center of the frame for our main follow shot. And this is a camera that's pretty much just straight down the center aisle, pointing at the center of the stage at the church. It's a little off center from the actual aisle. But this is a really great place to have that center shot and to get a great center up or waist up shot. The next composition is called the knees up shot. So let's go ahead, I'll zoom out a little bit here. I'll kind of find his knees, and then I'll use my headroom guide again, and I'll put the bottom of the frame just below his knees, and this is a knees up shot. So it's a bit wider. It might be easier to track someone if you're having to follow them back and forth, panning with your joystick controller here. This is the knees up shot. Next up, we're gonna have the elbows up shot. So this one could be good where maybe your pastor's at a point of a sermon where he's like really trying to drive home some sort of point in a softer voice, and maybe the image is gonna have a little bit more of an intimate feel, like you want the viewer to feel like they're like kind of up close and personal. I think that's where the elbow up shot can really come in handy. And then finally, we have a feet up shot. So this is probably the widest of all of the follow compositions that I would have. And this is where we can easily track someone. You can go side to side, Matt. I'll follow you with this framing. So as he starts walking, it's always going to be easier to track people, especially if you're tracking manually and you're not using the audio tracking features on these cameras. Manually tracking is very easy when you're wider. If I were to zoom in tighter to like an elbows up shot, just keep in mind you're gonna probably need a little bit more practice, and I'm gonna have to also adjust the speed on my joystick controller to be able to keep up with him. So just keep that in mind. It's always a little bit easier to manually track when you're wider. So whether you're using a PTZ camera or you're operating a manned camera, all of these same principles can apply for composition. I really think most of the time you're going to be using that waist up shot, and then maybe it's going to be split between the knees up, elbows up, and feet up pretty evenly. Or maybe you have a main camera, like camera 1 is always going to be a great waist up shot, and then camera 2, you can have that operator bounce between the feet up shot or an elbows up shot, and that can kind of give you some diversity of angles and compositions to work with as a video director. Let's dive into the rule of thirds and how that will affect framing and composition for your church live stream. So to demo this, I've got the CRN 700 by Canon, and it's kind of off to the side of our stage here, and it has a great side profile shot. So you can see me zooming in here, and it is just insane, the motors that are on this camera for zoom control, pan, and tilt control. So rule of thirds. When you're looking at the framing guide that I have here on my preview monitor, I'll put him in the center for now. So right now I have him centered kind of on a elbow up shot from the side. Looks pretty good. The bokeh is beautiful, even the light kind of flaring in the lens. It's a beautiful image. You look pretty good, Matt. Good job. So I love demoing the rule of thirds to you with this side profile shot because I think this is where things like rule of thirds shine. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pan the camera over so that Matt is now going to be on the left third of the image. And the important thing to understand with rule of thirds is you want to take into mind the looking room aspect of the image. So the looking room is going to be the space between Matt, who's on the left, and the remaining right side of the image. So his microphone's kind of in the middle right now, and then you can see just kind of empty space. So you want to set the looking room to be in the direction of kind of where your subject's looking. So even in this framing right now for this video, I'm kind of looking in this direction. That's why I framed this video to have me on this third of the image, and then the looking room is over here. So the same thing applies for your church's live stream as you're using the rule of thirds. Think, where are they looking? That's where the space needs to be. It is awkward if I were to pan the image over and then he's on the right side of the image. Look how just strange that looks, where the looking room is behind him and it's like, oh, that's a cool wall behind him, but now I have no sense of where he's actually looking. So that's a mistake you want to avoid with the rule of thirds. So I'm gonna go back to camera 1. If I zoom into camera 1, when it's a center shot just down the aisle, I really prefer just centering the subject in the frame. You're not really gonna often see me doing this or doing this where I have him on the side third of the image, unless maybe the pastor has like a TV or something that they're preaching with, like Andy Stanley style. To me, the center shot is usually going to be center aligned with the subject. And if we want to have the rule of thirds type effect there, that's where I will bring in the side profile shot, and I think that looks really sharp on worship leaders, pastors, any subject on stage. Now let's talk about camera movements, whether it's controlled by a joystick for PTZ or whether it's a manned tripod camera. You can move the camera, and the two primary movements in most settings are going to be the tilting and panning of the camera. So when we say tilt the camera, here I'll pull up camera 1 for you. If I go up, that's a tilt up. If I go down, that's going to be a tilt down. That's tilting. Tilting just kind of helps draw your eye to maybe just the height or the vertical dimension of a space, and sometimes that could be appropriate for your live stream. So then there's panning. Panning kind of does the same thing, but horizontally. I think this one is going to be a little bit more useful for most church live streams, and panning is simply when you move the camera left or right. I zoom the camera out, so now we're getting a nice slow pan across the room. I think shots like this can be great for establishing shots, maybe when the service opens and people can see the room, they can see the space, they can see the people before you cut to like tighter shots here of your worship leader. So that is panning and tilting, very basic ways of just moving the camera up or down, side to side. The next type of movement you can introduce with these types of cameras is zooming. So you can zoom in or you can zoom out. So here we have the camera 1. It's pretty wide right now. It's zoomed all the way out using the W toggle here on the zoom control. And if I press the T, it's going to zoom in. So I can go slow. These cameras can zoom in pretty fast. You want to be mindful of what you're actually showing. When your camera's live, you probably don't want to be actually showing some really fast zooming. Maybe if your camera is in preview or the operator has not selected it yet, you can make some faster movements, but when it's active, you don't want to zoom too quickly. I really love the precision of the controls on this camera controller because I'm just barely pressing down on the zoom button here, and you can see it's giving me a nice slow zoom, and it almost like feels like it lasts forever. So I can be zooming here, and then when I'm done, I'll just like cut out of that zoom. I'll keep the zoom active, and then I'll cut out of it to camera 3, and then I can stop zooming camera 1. And then you can get a similar effect by just zooming out. And this again kind of shows the viewer the breadth of the space that you're in. Sometimes I will zoom out and pan at the same time just to kind of keep the framing and composition looking right, because sometimes if you zoom out, there just might be too much headroom for your subject or whoever you're trying to keep centered in the image. So I'm pretty pleased with the types of looks and result that I can get with zooming out. What's great here is on the controller, I can turn up the zoom speed to be pretty high, or I can actually turn it all the way down. So no matter how hard I press the button on the controller, it's actually going at zoom speed of 1 right now. So that can be really handy if you're just wanting to have more precision and you're not trying to be paranoid about how much you're actually pushing down the hardware button. Same thing with the speed of the panning and tilting. I can turn that all the way up. So now if I go back and I move my joystick all the way to the right or left, it is going to pan and tilt quite quickly. Or if I go back into these settings, I'm going to go ahead and turn it down to 1 here. Now, no matter how far I move over the joystick controller, it's not going to go fast. It's on a slower pan tilt speed. So I actually like to have it kind of at a medium speed, and then I can physically determine if it ramps up fast or slows down by how far I move it to the right or left or up or down. You might not always be using PTZ cameras. Maybe you want a manned camera setup. This is the Canon XF605 professional camcorder, and it does pair perfectly with the CRN 500 and 700 because it also has that 1-inch sensor on it, and the color matches perfectly. So I'll go ahead and show you a comparison here. We've got the XF605 on this side shot, and then we have the CRN 500 on the center tight shot. What I love about the 605 is as a camera operator, I can make really great subtle changes both on the panning, the tilting, and the zooming. Don't get me wrong, the Canon joystick controller is awesome, it's precise, it's smooth, but nothing quite beats the ability to have both hands on the camera. I've got my left hand controlling the pan bar, and I've got my right hand controlling the zoom toggle, and I can make some really nice smooth movements. It's really easy for me to track my headroom and my composition. I've got a thirds grid on my monitor here on the camera, so just very simple operation. And all of the same principles apply when it comes to framing and composition when you're using a professional camcorder like this as it would to the PTZ cameras. When you approach your camera for the first time on sticks as an operator, you want to take into consideration what the tension is like on the tilting and the pan features on your tripod. It's always going to be a little bit different depending on the tripod you have. You definitely want to invest in a good quality tripod as well so it's nice and smooth. So I'm going to get my tension adjusted a little bit better. There we go. I like that. It's responsive. So here is a very tight headshot. I'll zoom out. Let's do a elbow up shot here. More waist shot, waist up shot. Then we've got, there's our knees up shot. There's our feet up shot. So I can, a little bit less headroom there. And again, my favorite thing about the Canon cameras, whether it's the PTZ or this XF605, is the autofocus. I'm zoomed all the way in, it's tracking his face, locks in on focus, I don't have to worry about a thing. And of course, if I wanted to, I could disable autofocus and do manual focus. I could just rack the focus right here. But most of the time, if you're using a professional camcorder like this, I'd recommend having it on sticks, having it be a center cam, or maybe a side profile shot like this one. It's gonna look great. It's gonna be easy to operate. One last thing I wanna mention about this camcorder is it does also network in. So you can actually control the color and exposure settings of this camera remotely, and you can actually monitor what it looks like from your video director position. So just in the same way we're able to adjust exposure and shade the color of our PTZ cameras, we could do the same thing with this professional camcorder. The key to camera operation is you always got to make sure you have intentionality and a subject. You just don't want your camera to be randomly pointing into space, even though it might be pointed at your stage or somewhere in your church. You want to make sure that you are clearly capturing the essence of where you want the attention of the viewer to go. So that's why framing and composition are really important. Don't forget headroom. Don't forget the rule of thirds. And when in doubt, just default to some basic compositions like we talked about earlier with that the center up or waist up shot that is going to be helpful for anybody who's trying to view your stream online. If I were operating these 3 cameras for a church live stream, here's the setup that I would be using and how I've configured the framing of each shot. So we've got camera number 1 here. That is going to be a great waist up center shot, and that's again going to be great for following the subject on stage. Camera number 2, it's at a great spot to be just showing the context of the room. So I would have it wider. I could go all the way out wide here. Maybe this is my shot that I could actually be doing some slow, zoom ins and zoom outs to give the live stream a little bit more camera movement. But it's very simple. It's easy for me to operate that and switch to it. And then camera number 3 could be a nice side profile shot following the rule of thirds. So again, here we only have 1 subject on stage. When you have more band members and just more going on, that's also when it would be nice to have a few more cameras. But even with 3 cameras, it's not terribly difficult to be readjusting them throughout the service and have great framing and composition for whatever's happening. One of the incredible features about these Canon PTZ cameras is the auto tracking feature. This could really come in handy during the worship service when your pastor is preaching on stage and giving a 30, 40, 60-minute message, and it can get a little tiresome having to track them the whole time with a follow camera. You can automate that process with these cameras. Here I'm in the web browser control interface for the CRN 500, and I'm gonna go to Settings. Under System, I'm gonna go to Add-ons, and then I'm gonna make sure that the auto tracking application is enabled for the camera. If I select it and if it's not running, there's gonna be a start button down here. So auto tracking is now running on the camera. I'm gonna go back to the camera controls. I'm gonna go to other functions here, and then under my add-on, I'll press View, and then I'll open the tracker, and it opens up in a different window. So what's really great about this interface is that they've created the composition guidelines and settings within the auto tracker. So these things we talked about already in this training about framing things properly with headroom, having different waist up shots or knee up shots or feet up shots. They actually designed this within the UI here for controlling auto tracking. So not only is it going to track the subject, but it's also going to make sure it's composed properly. So you can see here on the auto tracker, we have this silhouette that shows the size of the framing. So it's going to track a face within the frame, and then it's going to situate that face and the rest of the body within the little outline that you can see here. And as you can see, I can change the size of this. So if I go down, it's going to have a wider, more knee to head shot. And then if I go up to number 5 here, that's going to be more of an elbow up shot. So to get started with the auto tracking, what I like to do is turn on this toggle switch here. So now it's going to start searching. It's going to be in search mode. I can then adjust the display size of how I want the shot framed. So let's go a little bit wider, because again, I think it's going to be easier to track when it's like a waist or knee up shot. And then I'm just gonna start zooming in on the image, and you'll see it's eventually gonna pick up his face here in the auto tracking. So see, it picks up the face, and then it frames him, and now it's tracking. And I think, again, having it be a wider angle, it makes it easier for the camera to follow along, so it's not having to zoom so quickly. Also, when you see the final result in what we're recording from our program feed, it just looks and feels really natural. So then if I zoom in the display size here, it's going to do more of an elbow up shot, almost no headroom in there. And it's very impressive, its ability to track it. If he started moving a ton, it's probably going to lose tracking, but it's still keeping up. And I'll zoom out a little bit. And it looks like I lost him. So once you lose him, they're gonna go back to home base here. So what you can do there, if it just loses tracking and it goes to home base, what you can do is go to settings and then go to the next page, and then you can say viewing angle action when target is lost, say maintain viewing angle. So that's an important setting if you don't want it to sporadically go back to the main position there. And then down here on page 6, there's some interesting settings around, well, the display size. So we saw that already. It'll automatically zoom to the right display size that you want. So then we also have pan, tilt, halting area. You can configure an area for which the pan and tilt actions are not performed as long as the target is inside it. So make the pan tilt actions nimbler, make the area smaller. So the higher the sensitivity, the more nimble the tracking will be. So let's go ahead and have some higher sensitivity there. Press next, finish. Now let me go back in and see how these changes affected our tracking. I'll zoom in. It's a very tight shot. Now let's see if you can lose the tracking map. Okay, so it lost the tracking, and what's nice is it didn't just automatically go back to that fixed position where it was wide. It just stayed where it was. So now if I keep searching for him, I'll get it back onto tracking right here. And there we are. Now we're back. So I can adjust that display size. Let's kind of zoom out a bit, get more of a knee up shot. Very powerful tracking and automation capability with this camera. And it's important to remember you want to have the web browser accessible through a computer or a desktop computer that you have at your video switching station to be able to enable that feature during the service. Let's dive into video directing. In a system like what I'm running right now with my Canon PTZ cameras and my Canon joystick controller, I am simultaneously the camera operator and the video director. A camera operator is a person who is controlling the cameras. So you can have a camera operator at a PTZ controller who's moving cameras around and calling up presets. Or you can have a camera operator maybe at a manned camera tripod, a camera that's on sticks like the Canon Camcorder that we have here. A video director position is going to be the person who is actually in charge of directing how the video is going to be cut throughout your worship gathering. The mindset of a video director needs to be someone who is constantly thinking ahead. You understand the service plan, you know what songs are coming up next, you know if a prayer time's coming up or a sermon's coming up or communion or baptism. You really need to have a clear picture of the service flow because you're just going to be thinking about what's coming next so you aren't caught off guard as you're switching video. Video directors must also know how to accurately portray the energy of what's going on in the room for the online viewers. One common mistake I'll see is maybe a church has a multi-camera setup, whether it's 3, 5, 10 cameras. And what happens is the camera that is selected for a program, which is what your audience will see, it'll just hang out on one camera for too much time, especially if it's during the musical part of a worship gathering where there needs to be more energy, and again, it might vary depending on the type of song that's being played, but more often than not, I actually notice a lot of church video directors simply just not switching camera angles enough. It is possible to swing to the other side of the pendulum and switch really quickly and try to convey more energy than what is appropriate. But there's definitely a happy medium there, and that's where I would encourage you to think through television broadcasts that you might see elsewhere. Maybe it's a sporting event, maybe it is another musical type event, maybe it is another church broadcast from a larger church that you can look up to, and just they can set a nice example for us to kind of understand the appropriate pacing of when to make those cuts or fades in the live stream. So I'm switching about every few phrases of the song, which it might turn out to be a few seconds, it might be 5 seconds. That's usually about the sweet spot for me, timing-wise. So then here on a softer part, what I could do is maybe on camera 3, I would actually zoom in a bit more. Add some energy with camera 2. Let's maybe do like a slow pan, cut into it. And then camera 1. And then camera 3, maybe some faster cuts because it's the higher energy part of the song there. And then maybe on camera 2, I'll be zooming in, I'll cut to it, have a zoom in, go to 3. Go to camera 1. So that's a little bit of how I would do some simple cutting for a song like this. I feel like I'm listening to the song, I am listening to the lyrics and thinking about timing. Again, I think about attention spans of like, yeah, I feel like we've seen that angle for enough time. Usually maybe that's anywhere from just a few seconds, maybe 8 to 10 seconds at the most. Usually I wouldn't let an angle sit longer for that. When I'm operating both the PTZ cameras and cutting video, this does take practice. Getting used to, okay, which camera am I selecting and controlling, or what preset am I calling up? And then on my other device, what camera input am I gonna be previewing or switching to? So this is a skill, it takes time and practice. I would recommend practicing during actual band rehearsals at your church, not on Sunday morning. So it's important to show up for rehearsal. Cuts versus fades. I prefer using mostly cuts, especially during the music time. Sometimes though, maybe it's a slower song, a fade might be appropriate. I think stylistically, fades are a little old school and a little bit dated, especially if the fade is too long. If you have like a T-bar on your video switching controller, don't make it super long. I'd say a second or so fade would be appropriate. But most of the time, I would just default to cuts. I do like fades, like during the sermon, if you're fading in like graphics, like sermon slides, or fading them back out, I think that looks good as well. Another important thing to consider as a video director are your safe shots or your cover shots. These are going to be very important for those transitional moments during worship, maybe between your worship set and then your pastor comes up to start the sermon, or someone comes up to do announcements. It's very useful to be able to go, okay, camera 1 right now, this is my main follow cam, but when the song is done and Matt leaves the stage, maybe I could switch to camera 2, which is a nice wide shot of the whole stage here, and then that could be my cover shot or my safe shot while the next pastor's coming up, and then I could preview camera 1, I could get camera 1 situated to wherever that new pastor is, and then I can cut back to them for that transition. So it's really important to think through what transition's coming up, what shot can I use as a safe shot, and usually that's gonna be a wider angle, and then get your other shot prepped to cut to, and then make that cut. So it's really important to think through these transitions. What can you use as a safe shot, maybe a wider shot of the room, it's more establishing again and more context, and then it gives you time to move your primary follow cam to that next subject. As a video director, I would encourage you, again, to check out the examples of some churches out there who have very professional video teams. You don't have to completely copy or emulate them. them because yes, they have different infrastructure, they have different teams, but a lot of these same principles will apply when it comes to video directing and framing and composition. There's so many great examples to follow, and whenever you're watching something, watch it critically and just think about, oh, how are they framing? How are they cutting? What was the timing on that? Thanks so much for watching this video. Thank you so much, Canon, for sponsoring the video and providing the cameras. You can check out the description below for links to the cameras we demonstrated in this video. If you have any questions or comments, let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.